Ladies and gentlemen, this is Scary Bad Reviews, and this is my intro. So, it is Tuesday, October 8th. We have closed out our Week of the Vampire yesterday, and we are starting our Week of the Zombie today. Starting this one off a little bit differently. With the vampire, I wanted to kind of go back to the original roots. I went back to the 1930s Dracula with that one. I did not go all the way back. I could have gone back to Nosferatu, which was the 20s. But zombies I want to do a little bit differently. I feel that I've covered Night of the Living Dead multiple times within my short-lived reviewing, I guess, career, you could call it. I really enjoy the movie. I do think that it's an absolute masterpiece, and I do think it's one of the most important movies, not only in horror cinema, but in movies in general. But I feel like I've covered it enough to the point of where I don't want to start with it in this week. This week I wanted to start with its direct sequel. I wanted to start with Dawn of the Dead from 1978. This movie, it definitely has some iconic aspects to it. It definitely has some aspects that were detrimental into shifts in horror cinema as well as normal cinema within movies. The movie is not I have to say it's not the best made when it comes to acting and the dialogue between the characters. I find myself, each time I watch this movie, the scenes where you're supposed to be establishing emotional connections, you're supposed to be establishing who characters are, where there's dialogue between people within the movie, I find that to be some of the hardest parts of the movie to get through. None of the characters really get established that well. You don't really seem to have any emotional attachment to them. They don't seem to have very much emotional attachment to each other. They don't work very well on screen together. Where this movie really succeeds, and this is true for a lot of zombie movies, is within the zombies themselves and interactions between the living and the zombies. One of the most important aspects of this one is that they end up getting locked up within a shopping mall, and you have the whole, I don't know if it's a veiled critique, but I guess it's more of like a metaphor or a euphemism, comparing how American consumers were viewed within shopping malls in the late 70s, early 80s, when they were first kind of brought about in the way that we know them now. These were really the times that society and the market had shifted so that you had these huge town centers and you had these huge malls that would have just everything in them. And so at the time, a lot of people just flocked to it and stayed there and were drawn into it. And I think that was one of the things, of course, it's very apparent that that's what they were trying to do with this. I do think that you can kind of look at the setting of it in a way that it's a little bit more creative and that it gives them a lot of options to do a lot of different things with the zombies. Zombies have always kind of held societal and political undertones throughout all of their movies, and you'll see that get established in a couple different ways throughout this week. Just in having a character and a creature that is unrelenting but is completely brain dead and continually follows one thing. A lot of people within Hollywood, a lot of people within any form of media are able to use zombies as a metaphor or a caricature of a brain dead or a brain washed citizen. So you see a lot of societal context within a lot of these movies, and some of them you don't. Some of them are really just simplistic horror movies that are using the creature because they want to, and they want to use some practical effects or things like that. But this movie, you can definitely tell that there are statements to be made. The zombie effects are pretty good. Like, honestly, for it being 78, for the zombie genre being as young as it was, then the effects in it are pretty good. The zombies do look good. Any of the interactions and violence with the zombies does look good. The setting of a shopping mall outside of the context of it is actually really cool. Seeing just, hardware stores and, normal clothing stores and food courts and stuff like that, the escalators, just seeing these mindless creatures just kind of meandering about this massive structure was actually kind of one of the cooler parts of the movie, and it kind of does put into perspective when you get locked in how massive malls can be. I enjoyed this movie. I do think it's a lot of fun. I do think there's a lot wrong with it too. Usually when I watch this, I give it somewhere in that 6.57 range, just because the acting really does kind of take away in the scenes that people have one-on-one or small group dynamics. I think this time I'll probably settle in on that 6.5 range. I think that it's a very important movie. I do think that it plays a certain role in Hollywood in making that major statement while also pushing boundaries of what we're allowed to show on film. At the time, you had Night of the Living Dead come out in the late 60s. You had Psycho come out in the late 60s, and these were both movies that were trying to see how much they could get away with starting to show a combination of violence and blood and gore and stuff like that. And I think this movie definitely took that and ran away with it. Mind you, it's about 10 years past both of those movies. So there's a lot of things in between that kind of help it get away with more things. You have the birth of the slasher genre with the early adages like Texas Chainsaw and the first Halloween movie. So they were given kind of some breathing room, and then on top of that, they really pushed the ball even further and just showing grotesque zombie moments. I really do think that this is a good movie to watch around Halloween. I think that the prosthetics within the movie make it really fun. Nowadays, we kind of look back on special effects within certain movies and we just laugh at them because they look so bad. But in these, it really does you're able to distinguish between living and non-living. You're able to really point out zombies, and it really plays into some of the violence and some of the gore that we get from some of the zombie scenes. Horror fans, of course, need to watch it because of its significance within horror cinema. I think that all of George Romero's works, at least the first two, I'll give Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, I think are two very important movies when it comes to how horror subgenres really aligned, how we view zombies as a creature, because there wasn't really too much beforehand that had looked at it in that way. And he really was one of the first to put this massive societal commentary on a movie that is meant to scare you. There had been other instances of it. I do think that Frankenstein holds a pretty good societal context, as well as some. There are a few monster movies within the 50s that were trying to warn us about certain things. You have Godzilla coming out in the 50s, and that was to warn us about the dangers of the atomic bomb. But I think that Romero was able to do in these first two zombie movies what not very many directors have been able to in the past, and that is display an in-depth commentary on things in the world while also being able to excel at the elements that make a movie a horror movie, being able to scare people, being able to push the limits of special effects and gruesomeness within a film. I think he's always balanced all of these aspects together very well. And for such a simple creature that the zombie can be, he's used it in so many different ways. Like, he's used it in such a way that I don't think most people, that's the first thing that comes to mind in its use. So yeah, I think I'm going to teeter closer to the 6.5 on this one. I definitely think that Night of the Living Dead is a better movie. I think it's easier to watch. I think there's better acting within it. This one, there are times where the movie slows down almost to a crawl and it's difficult to get through. But I do think it is worth it. And a lot of it is really good zombie movie stuff. It's a fun watch, especially for horror fans. And I do recommend it to anybody for a good Halloween watch.
You say something so controversial yet so brave.
Alrighty, well that wraps it up for our first day and week of the zombie. Tomorrow we're going to be looking at definitely the goofier side of the creature. We're going to be going to The Return of the Living Dead in 1985. This is a much more... I can't even think of another word other than goofy. I mean, there's so much to it that's just 80s and really just trying to have fun with prosthetics, and there's no real outside context to most of it. It'll definitely be a 180 turn from anything that Romero does. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe. If you have any ideas for me over this week of the zombie, please let me know, and thank you for listening.